Mark had always thought of his family as the epitome of stability. He and Laura, his wife of 8 years, had built their life together from the ground up. Their daughter, Emma, was the heart of their world. She was a bright, curious child with a contagious laugh, and Mark couldn't help but feel pride every time she came running toward him, eager for one of their spontaneous adventures. Their home was filled with love, even if it wasn't always perfect. No family was. Mark had known from the start that Laura's relationship with her parents was complicated. They were well-off, traditional, and opinionated. While they often expressed affection for their daughter, their criticisms of Mark had never been far behind. Whether it was his career choices, his laid-back parenting style, or his desire to prioritize time with family over work, nothing seemed to be quite good enough for them. At first, he tried to ignore it, chalking it up to them being old-fashioned. But as the years went on, their comments became harder to dismiss. Laura, ever the dutiful daughter, had learned how to keep the peace. She never outright defended Mark, but she didn't indulge her parents' criticisms either. In the beginning, Mark tried not to let it get to him. He loved his wife and wanted to maintain harmony, especially for Emma's sake. But little by little, those unresolved tensions started to chip away at their relationship. Mark began to feel like an outsider in his own home. As Emma grew older, things changed in subtle ways. Laura, who had once been a fierce advocate for their daughter, had started to retreat into herself. Her laughter, once so easy, became more controlled, her smiles less frequent. It wasn't that she didn't love Emma. Mark could see that. But there was something missing. She had stopped standing up for their daughter, stopped seeing her as a priority, and that worried him. It was a quiet Friday evening when Mark realized how fragile their family's foundation had become. Laura's parents were coming over for a casual dinner, just like any other weekend. And as usual, Mark did his best to make the night pleasant. He spent hours preparing dinner, creating the perfect atmosphere for a family gathering. Emma, as usual, was her playful, energetic self, eager to spend time with her grandparents. Mark was hoping for a peaceful evening, one where the criticisms of his in-laws would be left at the door. But deep down, he knew that there were cracks in the surface, cracks that he had ignored for too long. What was supposed to be a simple family dinner would soon reveal how thin the veneer of their happiness had become. The night began like so many others. The table was set, the aroma of roasted chicken and vegetables filled the air, and soft music played in the background. Mark had always believed in creating a warm atmosphere, hoping it would bridge the gap between himself and Laura's parents. He wanted them to see what he saw every day: a happy home, a loving wife, and a child who was his world. Emma, wearing her favorite yellow dress, had been buzzing with excitement at just 6 years old. She adored family gatherings, though she never truly understood the undercurrent of tension that often accompanied her grandparents' visits. She only wanted to impress them, to be seen, to be loved. When Laura's parents arrived, Emma rushed to the door, greeting them with a bright smile and a handmade drawing she had worked on all afternoon. "Look, Grandma, I made this for you," she said, holding up the colorful picture of a house, a tree, and 3 stick figures holding hands. Her grandmother smiled faintly, accepted the drawing, and said, "That's nice, dear," before turning to kiss Laura on the cheek. Her grandfather barely glanced at the paper, muttering something about childish scribbles. Mark's chest tightened, but he forced a smile. He'd learned to swallow his frustration. Tonight, he told himself, would be different. Dinner began pleasantly enough. Conversation was polite, if a bit one-sided. Laura's parents spoke at length about their social circle, their upcoming trips, and acquaintances' children who had already excelled in private schools. Mark listened, nodding where appropriate, trying to ignore the subtle digs about his own modest career. He wasn't a doctor, lawyer, or businessman, just a project manager who valued time with his family more than long hours at the office. Emma, sensing a lull in the conversation, decided to contribute. She proudly told her grandparents about the stories she had read at school and how she had learned to write her own name in cursive. As she excitedly demonstrated on her napkin, her small hand slipped, and she accidentally knocked over a glass of water. The clear liquid spilled across the table, dripping onto the floor. The room fell silent. Emma's eyes widened in horror. I'm sorry," she cried, scrambling to grab a napkin. But before Mark could reassure her, Laura's father chuckled. Clumsy girl. Can't even hold a glass properly. Her mother joined in with a laugh. Honestly, Laura, she takes after Mark, always making a mess of things. The words cut deeper than they probably intended. They weren't just mocking Emma. They were mocking him too, using his daughter as a weapon. Mark looked at Laura, waiting for her to say something. Surely she would defend Emma. Surely she wouldn't let her own parents belittle their child. But then it happened. Laura laughed. A soft giggle at first, then a full chuckle as she shook her head. She's just like her dad, Laura said, smiling at her parents. Mark froze. Emma lowered her head, her cheeks burning red. She whispered, I didn't mean to, but her small voice was drowned out by the laughter of the adults at the table. In that moment, something inside Mark cracked. It wasn't the insult itself. He could endure their disdain. He had endured it for years. But watching his daughter shrink in shame, while the one person who should have defended her instead joined the ridicule, was unbearable. Enough, Mark said sharply, his voice louder than he intended. The laughter stopped. Everyone turned to him. She's a child, he continued, his hands gripping the edge of the table. She made a mistake. That doesn't make her useless or clumsy. And it sure as hell doesn't make her like me in some kind of insult. Don't you dare talk to her that way. The room went silent. Laura's parents exchanged glances, clearly offended by his outburst. Laura shifted uncomfortably in her chair, avoiding his gaze. Emma sat frozen, her eyes wide with both fear and relief that someone had finally defended her. Her grandmother sniffed. There's no need to be so dramatic, Mark. We were only joking. Mark's voice was cold. If that's your idea of a joke, then it's not welcome in my house. The rest of dinner passed in stiff silence. Conversation died, and plates were cleared with forced politeness. Emma barely touched her food, her appetite gone. Mark spent the remainder of the meal focused entirely on her, offering her gentle smiles and words of reassurance. But inside, his heart was heavy. When the evening finally ended and Laura's parents left, Mark closed the door and stood in the quiet of the house. His daughter had already retreated to her room, leaving him alone with his wife. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. That night, Mark realized it wasn't his in-laws who had delivered the real blow. It was Laura. Her laughter at their daughter's expense had pierced him more deeply than years of insults ever could. For the first time, he began to wonder if his marriage, the foundation of the family he cherished, was as strong as he had believed. The crack had appeared, and soon it would widen into a fault line that would change everything. The silence that lingered in the house that night felt suffocating. Mark paced in the living room, his mind racing. He couldn't focus on anything, not even the television he had absent-mindedly turned on. The images flickered across the screen, but his mind was elsewhere, on Emma, on Laura, and on what had just happened. His pulse quickened as he thought about the way his daughter had shrunken on herself. Her small face flushed with embarrassment. She deserved better, Mark thought, clenching his fists. He had always known his in-laws were dismissive and rude, but this time it wasn't just about them. It was about Laura, his wife, the woman who was supposed to stand by him, the woman who should have stood up for their daughter. Instead, she had laughed. She had laughed at their little girl. It had been hours since their guests left, and still, Mark hadn't spoken a word to Laura. She had retreated to their bedroom, and he couldn't bring himself to follow. Not yet. The minutes stretched into an hour, and finally, Mark knew he couldn't avoid it anymore. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, that the cracks in their marriage weren't getting bigger. He walked slowly up the stairs, his steps deliberate. When he reached their bedroom, he found the door slightly ajar. Through the crack, he saw Laura sitting on the edge of bed, her head in her hands. The sight tore at him. There was a vulnerability there, a sense of guilt, but there was also something else, a distance that had been growing for years, something that had finally revealed itself tonight. Mark didn't knock. He didn't need to. He just pushed the door open and stood in the doorway, watching her. Laura didn't look up. She didn't even flinch. She knew what was coming. Laura, Mark's voice was thick with emotion, but it was controlled. He couldn't let the anger consume him. Not yet. We need to talk. At first, she didn't respond. Then, after a long silence, she finally lifted her head, her eyes red from holding back tears. She looked tired, defeated. "I know," she whispered. "I'm sorry, Mark. But the apology was too little, too late." Mark shook his head, unable to hold back the surge of frustration that welled up inside him. "Sorry? Is that all you have to say?" His voice was rising now, the hurt bubbling up uncontrollably. Laura looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want to hurt Emma. It just happened." Mark stepped into the room, his footsteps heavy as he crossed the floor toward her. "You didn't want to hurt her?" He let out a bitter laugh. "You laughed, Laura. You laughed when they insulted her. You didn't even try to stop them. You didn't offend our daughter. You laughed along with them. Like me." The words stung as soon as they left his mouth, but the truth was too raw for him to stop. Laura stood up, her face pale. She reached out as if to touch him, but Mark stepped back, raising his hand. "No, don't touch me. Not right now." She flinched, pulling her hand back. The hurt in her eyes was more than Mark could bear, but it didn't change what had happened. He couldn't just forget it. Not this time. "I was trying to keep the peace, Mark," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand. They're my parents. They're always like this. And I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't want to make things worse." Mark's chest tightened as the words settled in. "So, you thought laughing was the best way to handle it? You couldn't even stand up for Emma? You couldn't even stand up for me?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustration making his movements sharper. "I'm not asking you to pick a side, Laura. I'm asking you to protect our daughter. You're supposed to be on our team, but you sided with them. You sided with her, the woman who was belittling our child." "I wasn't siding with them, Mark. I wasn't." Her voice faltered, but she didn't finish the sentence. She seemed to realize that her reasoning sounded weak. Mark took a step closer to her, his eyes burning with anger and hurt. "But you didn't stop it. You didn't care enough to stop it. You let them treat her that way. You stood there and laughed like it was nothing." He turned away, pacing toward the window, looking out into the dark yard. "How can I trust you, Laura? How can I trust that you'll ever stand up for me or Emma when it matters most? You've always let them walk all over you, but now it's affecting our daughter, and I'm not going to stand by and let that happen." Laura's voice broke as she spoke. "Mark, please. I love you both. I do. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to make everyone happy. I didn't want to make it worse. I didn't want to make them mad." Mark closed his eyes, breathing deeply. "You think you can make everyone happy, don't you? But all you've done is make us both miserable." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was suffocating, and Mark could feel the weight of the decision that was coming. This wasn't just about that one moment. This was about everything. Years of small moments when Laura had chosen her parents over him, when she had failed to see how her actions affected their family. Finally, Mark turned back to her, his voice soft but firm. "I can't do this anymore, Laura. I can't keep pretending everything's okay when you're not willing to stand up for us. Not for me. Not for Emma." The finality of his words hit her like a physical blow. Laura's eyes welled with tears, but Mark couldn't bring himself to comfort her. This was too much. He was too far gone. "I'm done," Mark said quietly, as if confirming something he had known for a long time. "I'm done. I'm not asking for an apology. I'm asking for a change, and I don't think you're willing to make it. Not for me and not for Emma." He took one last look at her, the woman he had loved, the woman who was a mother of his child. And then he turned and walked out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him, and Laura was left alone, standing in the emptiness of their shattered marriage. The next few days felt like a blur to Mark. It was as if his world had suddenly been pulled out from under him, leaving him afloat in an overwhelming sea of confusion, anger, and hurt. The confrontation with Laura had shattered the last vestiges of what it tried to preserve. He couldn't stop thinking about the look on her face when he walked out of their room. It wasn't just sorrow. It was regret. But regret alone wasn't enough. She had crossed a line, that he couldn't ignore. And now, he had to deal with the consequences of that betrayal. The house, which had once been filled with laughter, playfulness, and the hum of everyday life, now felt eerily quiet. Emma seemed to sense the change, though she didn't fully understand it. She had been more withdrawn, her usual energy replaced by a quiet sadness that Mark couldn't bear to see. He did his best to comfort her, to reassure her that everything would be okay, but deep down, he knew that things would never be the same again. Laura, too, had changed. She hadn't spoken much since their argument, except for a few attempts at apology that seemed more like pleas than genuine remorse. Each time she reached out, Mark recoiled, unsure whether he could believe her words. She seemed so distant, so broken in her own way. But Mark couldn't help but wonder, was it because she was truly sorry, or because she was scared of losing him? Every time he looked at her, all he could think about was the moment she laughed with her parents, when she chose him over him and their daughter. That was the moment everything had changed. The day Mark finally spoke to Laura again, it wasn't because he wanted to resolve things. It was because they had to. Emma needed closure, and the rift between her parents couldn't be ignored. She had begun asking questions, noticing the tension in the air, asking why Mommy and Daddy weren't talking like they used to. Mark had put it off for as long as he could, but now there was no avoiding it. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the space between them seemingly growing with every passing second. Laura had tried to prepare a small breakfast for Emma, a feeble attempt at normalcy, but the air was thick with unspoken words. Emma was playing with her food, clearly sensing that something was wrong. Mark glanced at her, and then at Laura, his heart heavy with the realization that this wasn't just about him anymore. "We need to talk about what happened," Mark said, his voice steady, though it trembled slightly with emotion. He wasn't sure what he wanted from this conversation. He didn't know if he even wanted to reconcile with Laura, but he knew that for Emma's sake, they had to at least acknowledge the cracks in their family. Laura nodded silently, her eyes already filling with tears. "I know," she said softly. "I'm sorry, Mark. I really am. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Mark clenched his jaw, trying to hold himself together. "I'm not sure what's worse, the fact that you laughed at Emma, or the fact that you didn't even care to stop it." "I do care," she said quickly, her voice pleading. "I was trying to make everything okay. I didn't want to make things worse between us. You don't understand how difficult it is to stand up to my parents." Mark shook his head in disbelief. "It's not about standing up to them, Laura. It's about standing up for your daughter. I'm her father. She's supposed to be your priority. Not them, not their insults." "I know, and I'm sorry," she repeated, her voice breaking. "I should have defended her. I should have said something. I was wrong. But I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't know how to make it stop." Mark's voice softened slightly, though the hurt was still raw. "Laura, this isn't just about that one incident. It's about all the times I felt like I've been invisible. All the times you let them treat me like I'm not good enough for you. And worse, when you let them treat our daughter like that. How could you not see how much it hurt her?" Laura reached out to him, but Mark stood up before she could touch him. He could feel her desperation, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to erase the hurt. "I love you," she said softly, her voice filled with a tenderness that used to make him feel safe. "I love Emma. I was just so scared of losing everything. My parents, you, our family, I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to be the wife and mother you wanted me to be." Mark felt a pang of sympathy, but it wasn't enough to fix what had been broken. "I don't know if you ever will," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again. Not after what happened." There was silence for a long time, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. "Mark," Laura said, her voice trembling, "what are we going to do? How do we fix this?" Mark turned away from her, walking toward the window, his back to her. He didn't have an answer. Not yet. Not when everything felt so fractured. Days passed and the tension only grew. Mark couldn't bring himself to look at Laura without feeling a surge of anger and betrayal. He couldn't forget the way she had sided with her parents, the way she had dismissed their daughter's worth with a laugh. And despite her apologies, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just about that one moment. It was about years of neglect, years of choosing comfort over confrontation. Laura had moved into the guest room after their conversation, but Mark could still hear her crying through the walls at night. He wasn't sure if it was remorse or guilt, but it made everything harder to bear. Emma, sensing the growing distance between her parents, had withdrawn even further, retreating into herself as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Mark knew that their marriage wasn't the same. The trust that had once held them together had been shattered, and no amount of apologies could repair the damage. He had tried to ignore the signs, to keep the peace for the sake of their daughter. But now, he couldn't keep pretending. The fallout was inevitable. The decision wasn't easy. It never was. But Mark knew that for the sake of his own happiness, and most importantly for Emma's well-being, he couldn't stay in a marriage that had become so toxic. It wasn't just about Emma's feelings anymore. It was about his own, and he had to make a choice. Mark sat at the edge of his bed late one night, staring into the darkness. The house was quiet, but it was not the comforting quiet of peace. It was a silence of distance. Emma was asleep in her room, clutching the stuffed bunny he had bought her when she was 3. Laura was in the guest room again, a closed door separating them, both physically and emotionally. The weight of it all pressed down on him like a stone he couldn't shake off. The confrontation had broken the surface of their problems, but the fallout made it clear that their marriage wasn't salvageable, not without a fundamental change. And Mark no longer believed that change was possible. He had spent years waiting for Laura to stand up for him, for their daughter, for the family they had built together. Instead, she had let her parents chip away at their bond, piece by piece, until nothing but resentment was left. The laughter, her laughter, still echoed in his mind. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a symbol of betrayal, of weakness, of priorities twisted in all the wrong ways. For days, Mark went back and forth in his mind. Divorce was never something he had wanted. He had sworn, when he married Laura, that he would love her through the storms of life. But what he hadn't expected was that the storm would come from within their own home, from the very person who had promised to protect their child. His heart ached at the thought of Emma. She deserved better. She deserved a mother who would shield her, not mock her. She deserved a home where laughter wasn't cruel, but kind. Mark realized that the example he set now would shape Emma's understanding of love, loyalty, and respect for years to come. It was Emma who finally tipped the scales. One morning, as Mark was helping her get ready for school, she looked up at him with her big brown eyes and asked, "Daddy, am I really useless?" The words pierced him like a knife. He knelt down, taking her small hands in his. "No, sweetheart. You're the most wonderful, precious, amazing girl in the world. Don't you ever believe otherwise." "But Mommy laughed," Emma whispered, her voice fragile. Mark hugged her tightly, feeling his throat close with emotion. In that moment, his decision became clear. He couldn't let Emma grow up in an environment where her worth was questioned, where her mother's silence, or worse, her complicity, allowed others to wound her spirit. That night, after putting Emma to bed, Mark sat down at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen. His hands trembled as he began to write. He wasn't writing a love letter, nor an angry tirade. He was writing the truth. When Laura came into the kitchen, her eyes red and swollen, she looked at him warily. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. "I'm writing down what needs to change," Mark replied, his voice steady. "And if it can't change, then I'm writing down what comes next." Laura sat across from him, silent, as he listed everything that had led them here. The constant belittling by her parents, her refusal to stand up for him and Emma, the night of the laughter that broke their family apart. "You've had chance after chance to show me where your loyalties are," Mark said, finally looking up at her. "But every time you chose them. You chose comfort instead of protecting your daughter. You chose silence instead of respect. I can't do this anymore, Laura. I won't let Emma grow up believing she isn't enough." Laura's tears spilled over, her hands trembling as she reached for his. "Please, Mark, don't do this. I'll change. I'll tell my parents to stay away. I'll make it right." Mark pulled his hand back gently, but firmly. "You should have done that years ago. You should have done it the first time they insulted me, the first time they mocked Emma. But you didn't, and now it's too late. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. For the first time, Laura seemed to understand that he wasn't bluffing. This wasn't another argument that would blow over in a few days. This was the end. "I'll be filing for divorce," Mark said quietly. "I'll do everything I can to make sure Emma's life stays stable, but I won't raise her in this environment anymore." Laura sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "Please, Mark, don't take her away from me." Mark's chest ached, but his resolve didn't falter. "I'm not taking her away. You're her mother and she needs you, but I'll fight to make sure she's safe, emotionally, mentally, and physically. That's my responsibility as her father, and I won't fail her." He stood then, leaving the paper on the table. Written in his careful, deliberate handwriting were the words he couldn't take back. "This marriage is over, but my duty to Emma will never end." As he walked down the hall to check on his daughter, Mark felt both a crushing sadness and an unexpected clarity. The road ahead would be hard. There would be battles in court, arguments about custody, painful moments when Emma asked questions he couldn't fully answer. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing the right thing. He was taking action, not just for himself, but for the little girl who needed him more than ever. And though his marriage was ending, his love for his daughter gave him the strength to begin again. The first week after Mark filed for divorce felt like stepping into uncharted territory. The weight of the decision was heavy, but there was also a strange, liberating clarity. For so long, he had been stuck in the cycle of hoping things would change, clinging to a marriage that was little more than a fragile illusion. Now, the illusion was gone. The pain was real, but so was the chance for something new. Mark moved into a modest apartment a few miles away, close enough for Emma to stay connected to her school and friends. The space was smaller than the house, but it was quiet, calm, and, most importantly, free of the tension that had plagued him for years. He decorated Emma's new room with her favorite colors, filled it with drawings she'd made, and made sure her bunny sat on the bed waiting for her. The first night she stayed there, Emma looked around nervously. "It's different," she whispered. Mark hugged her and smiled. "It is, but different doesn't have to be bad. This is our place, a place where you'll always be safe and loved." Emma leaned into him, and for the first time in weeks, she seemed to relax. Adjusting to co-parenting with Laura was not easy. Their conversations were strained, often clipped and businesslike, revolving only around Emma's needs. Laura had begged him not to go through with the divorce, but once the papers were filed, she seemed resigned, her energy drained. Mark didn't feel triumphant about it. If anything, he felt sorrow at what they had lost. But that sorrow was softened by the knowledge that he had chosen the healthier path for Emma. There were challenges, of course. Explaining the situation to Emma in age-appropriate ways was one of the hardest things he had ever done. "Mommy and Daddy both love you very much," he told her gently one evening. "But we're not going to live in the same house anymore. It doesn't change how much we care for you." Emma looked down at her hands and asked the question Mark had dreaded. "Is it because of me?" Mark's heart broke, but he lifted her chin so she could see the conviction in his eyes. "No, sweetheart, it's not because of you. It's because Mommy and I made mistakes. But you're the best thing that ever happened to us. Never ever think otherwise." She nodded slowly, and though the sadness lingered in her eyes, Mark could see she believed him. Over time, the quiet apartment began to feel like home. Mark and Emma established new routines: Saturday pancake breakfast, Sunday afternoon walks in the park, and bedtime stories that ended with Emma giggling under the covers. Slowly, the weight she had carried seemed to lift. Mark, too, began to heal. For years, he had defined himself by the cracks in his marriage, by the struggle of trying to make it work. Now he was learning to define himself differently, as a father first, and as a man who had chosen to protect what mattered most. He even found small joys in solitude: cooking simple dinners with Emma, reading books late at night, listening to music without worrying about criticism. All reminded him that life didn't end with Laura. In many ways, it was just beginning. The past wasn't something he could erase. There were still nights when the memories returned. The laughter, the betrayal, the silence that grew between him and Laura. But with each passing day, those memories lost some of their power. One evening, as Emma snuggled up beside him on the couch, she whispered, "Daddy, I like our new home." Mark felt tears sting his eyes, but this time they weren't from sorrow. They were from hope. "Me too, sweetheart," he said softly, kissing the top of her head. "Me too." For the first time in a long while, Mark believed that the future could be brighter than the past. And though the road ahead wouldn't be without its challenges, he knew one thing for certain. He and Emma would face it together, stronger than ever,